All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to BGSU Science Cafe. This is the first one of this new academic year, new semester. I'm Kevin McClooney. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies. I'll be your host this evening. We have a great event tonight, but first I want to thank the Division of Research and Economic Engagement, Marketing and Brand Strategy, and WBGU for helping to make tonight possible, as well as our graduate coordinator, Kelly Bryant. Our event tonight is modeled after the International Science Cafe movement, which encourages informal conversations between scientists and the public. Thus, the talk will be short and aimed at a general audience with about 30 minutes devoted to discussion with the speaker and the panel at the end. Our main presenter tonight is Jon Sprague. He is the Director of Science and Research for the Ohio Attorney General. He's a BCI Eminent Scholar and former Director of the Ohio Attorney General's Center for the Future of Forensic Science at BGSU. Dr. Sprague holds a PhD from Purdue University. So tonight, Jon will be speaking with you about the opioid epidemic in Ohio. So please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here tonight and share with you some of the work we've been doing as we've been monitoring the opioid crisis here in the state of Ohio. As we get started tonight, I'm going to actually divide the talk into two areas. One area will focus predominantly on trends that we are seeing at the state level when it comes to opioid overdoses. The second focuses on the efforts we have made using science to develop innovative methods for hopefully combating this problem that we're seeing at the state level. So when you look at this, my title slide here, the picture in the center is actually of rainbow fentanyl. This is actually a picture taken from the DEA. There's some notices that just went out in the last week of rainbow fentanyl being seen on the street. You'll notice that they almost look like candy, and that's the scary part of what we're seeing with some of the things we'll be talking about tonight with fentanyl. My objectives tonight are actually to discuss the current trends that we're seeing in the state of Ohio. I'll give a brief overview of what we're seeing at the federal and national levels, describe some of the chemical modifications that are occurring to fentanyl, the chemistry game that's being played with these molecules. And then we'll talk a little bit about pharmacogenetics and how pharmacogenetics may be used in the context of opioid use disorder. So OUD is opioid use disorder. And then I'll discuss a study that we've been doing statewide looking at pharmacogenetics and opioid use disorder. So if we look at the national data first, there's just a few comments on the national data. This is data from the CDC and from the U.S. Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking report from this year. The CDC estimates that in 2021, over 107,000 people succumbed to drug overdose. Of those, a majority of those deaths were attributed to fentanyl. That's about 170 fatalities a day, and predominantly in the age group 18 to 45. And that's what we saw here in the state of Ohio too, is that the age group that is largely affected is 18 to 45, but it's not limited to that age group. The cost of this opioid crisis to the United States is now over $1 trillion a year. And then finally, where's this stuff coming from? And what we've seen, and according to the U.S. Commission report, is that the precursors or the ingredients that are used to make fentanyl are coming from China. So precursors are, think of baking cookies, and that you need your sugar, your flour, and precursors are the ingredients we need to make fentanyl. So those precursors are coming from China, they're being shipped to Mexico, and the Mexican cartel then is producing the counterfeit form of these tablets. This happens to be a picture from the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago. And what you see in this picture is that this is the laboratory, and I use that word in quotes, by which the fentanyl is being made. Notice it's an outdoor lab with no good laboratory practices being conducted. So at the national level, that kind of sets the stage for what we've been seeing. When we look at the opioid epidemic, what we see it described as is in 3 phases. And so what this figure shows, and I'll show you a lot of figures that look similar to this, on the y-axis is death rates per 100,000, and then we got time on the x-axis in years. The opioid epidemic is described in 3 ways. The first wave is actually attributed to prescription opioids. And that wave started actually in 1999 and is actually contributing to opioid deaths predominantly from 99 to 2010. Then wave 2 started, and these waves always overlap to some degree. Wave 2 is attributed to heroin, that started in 2010. And then we saw this switch to synthetic forms of opioids, predominantly fentanyl, in 2013. So when you look at this graph and you look at this blue line here for heroin, you see that the heroin death rates were starting to increase, and we started to plateau off, and really it plateaued until just recently, and there's been a slight downward trend. Whereas the synthetic forms of opioids, mainly fentanyl, you see this upward trend that has continued to climb. So has death from any opioid in general. So this 3 waves is described in the literature for the opioid epidemic, but what we've actually seen here in the state of Ohio, and is what we've proposed in some of the work that we've done, there may actually be a COVID-19 pandemic induced wave in opioid overdose deaths. So what have we seen here in Ohio, and what have we been doing? The team that I have with me here tonight, we've been actually, we actually queried the Ohio Department of Health, ODH's database, and we looked at the mortality data set, and specifically looked at deaths related to opioids. And then we did what's called a temporal trend analysis, and we utilized a change point analysis looking at quarterly data for opioid overdose deaths. That's OOD, is opioid overdose deaths, at rate per 100,000 from Q1 of 2010 to Q2 of 2020. When we look at our initial findings, and I'm going to expand out to where we are today through Q1 of 2022, but I'm going to really look and focus what we saw initially during the pandemic before I expand to that point. So when we look at this graph, again, the y-axis is death rate per 100,000. Along the x-axis are the quarterly data, so from Q1 2010 to Q2 of 2022. And what we saw was this increase in opioid overdose death numbers, and before the pandemic we saw a spike in opioid overdose deaths in Q1 of 2017, and so this is where the peak was. And then in 2017 we started to see this downward trend in opioid overdose deaths, and it kind of plateaued off from first quarter of 2018 to Q1 of 2020, and that's where my cursor's at. But then what happened in Q2? Q2 is where the pandemic caused shutdowns, and we saw all the things that happened during that pandemic, and we saw a new spike, a new peak increase in opioid overdose deaths. So that's just a general trend when we look at the overall opioid death rate. We looked a little further here at the state of Ohio, and we wanted to see which counties were affected the most during that peak in opioid overdose deaths. And what you see in this figure is that the highest death rate was seen down here in Scioto County, followed by Fayette County, and then Franklin County. And why we looked at these top 10 counties is it's allowed us to then use the data that we were seeing to help drive and implement some of the things we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. But it's using data to help us make decisions on how we might want to target our plans. The right-hand side is death rates by largest counties, those counties with the largest cities. Notice that the top county for opioid overdose deaths was Franklin County here, followed by Montgomery, and then Mahoney County over here on the east side of the state of Ohio. So this is what the trend analysis looks like. This is the statistical analysis that we did, and I want to orient you so that you can see and start to orient your eyes to looking at this type of data. So again, death rate per 100,000 is on the left-hand y-axis, quarterly time, meaning Q1 through quarter of 2010 through Q2 of 2020 is on the x-axis. The open circles here is the graph we just looked at. So there's that peak in opioid overdose deaths we saw here in quarter one of 2017, followed by the downward drop, and then again the upward trend in quarter two of 2020. This blue line represents a trend analysis, and this is the trend analysis that we did. And what you see is that there was this upward trend through 2017. Now on the bottom down here, you see these black lines. The black lines correspond over here to our p-values. And what you see is this downward trend that occurs here at quarter one of 2018, meaning that the reason we see two trend lines, this blue line, is that we start a new trend line here in 2018. You see this flat line developing. But then where your eyes will really start to focus is here at this red dot and this yellow line. The red dot is what the trend analysis would have predicted the opioid overdose death rate to be. The yellow line is what we actually saw. So we saw this striking increase in opioid overdose deaths between quarter one and quarter two of 2020. This has remained to be the highest quarter for opioid overdose deaths since that time. So that's the way to look at these graphs, and I'll go through these through different types of analyses that we did. So when we then looked at the population data within the Ohio Department of Health's database separates out white, black population, Asian population. But when you look at the overall data, the overall opioid death data is that was highest among the white and black populations, to the point at which that the other populations were minuscule and contributed very little to our data analysis. So we separated out what we were seeing in both the white and black populations. So panel A is here on the left is for the white population. What you see here again, looking at those trend lines, you see again that upward trend, the break where we saw that significant change, and then a flat line. And again, what you see is a spike in overdose deaths here in quarter two that was significantly higher than what the predicted value would have been. What I like to point out over here in the black population data is that the scale is different. It has a higher scale going to 14 deaths per 100,000. Again, there's your trend line, but notice what we see though from quarter one of 2018 to quarter two of 2020. There was already an upward trend in the opioid overdose death rate in the black population. However, during the pandemic, there was still an increase in overdose deaths compared to what the predictive value would have been. We dug a little further and we looked at males versus females. Again, the y-axis changes here on the left axis. Notice that for males, we see this upward trend, but it spikes again in quarter two of 2020, much higher than the predicted value. Same thing on the female side. Notice the y-axis is lower, so there's a lower death rate per 100,000. But again, you saw the same thing where this spike occurred from quarter one to quarter two of 2020, much higher than what the predicted value would have been. Look at age groups. The age groups here is that showing that in the age group 18 to 39, as I was saying earlier, is where we see the highest death rates in general. Again, the x-axis is different here on the 18 to 39 age group because the highest numbers were here. But again, notice then from quarter one of 18 to quarter two of 2020, again, that spike in quarter two in that timeline. Notice how large that spike is here in that age group. But all age groups were affected. Even those over the age of 40, we saw another a spike in the overdose death rate in that age group also. So when you look at this data, we see a high death rates in the 18 to 39 age group, as was seen at the national level. We've extended that data. We continue to monitor and do the analysis that we were talking about with this temporal change analysis that we were talking about. But we extended this out now through quarter one of 2022. Why only quarter one of 22? There's always a lag of about 6 months between data collection and incorporation into the ODH database. What you see here is that there's your trend line analysis. Quarter two of 2020 still remains the highest death rate period. But again, you see that these numbers are extremely high. There appears to be a slight downward trend here. However, it's still extremely high for an overall opioid overdose death rate through Q2 of 2022. So that's some of the trends we saw from opioid overdose death rates. We also looked at total death count numbers related to opioids. And this graph looks at death counts from 2007 through the end of 2021. And we got two portions of this graph. The blue line is representing all opioids, whereas the black line is fentanyl and fentanyl-related compounds. And I'll explain why we really started to focus in on fentanyl. So if you look at the blue line, this blue line looks very similar to the trend analysis that we had, is that we saw this upward trend through 2017, a downward drop, and then it started to climb back up. Here's 2020 data, here's 2021 data, this large increase in opioid overdose deaths. Notice it's over 4,000 deaths each year in the state of Ohio. The black squares, the black open squares, are fentanyl-related deaths. And so what you notice from 2007 to 2013 is that we really were not seeing many deaths related to fentanyl. But after 2013, it continued this upward climb in fentanyl-related deaths. And then to the point here where in 2021, that you see that the fentanyl-related deaths and the all opioid-related deaths almost overlap one each other, meaning that fentanyl is contributing the largest percentage to the overall opioid deaths in 2021. In fact, if you look at the gap between all opioids and fentanyl throughout this period here, you see that the gap is fairly wide, but it closes in from 2019 through 2021. So fentanyl is the major driver in these overdose deaths. If we look at overall death counts and we look at males, females, whites, blacks, as we did previously, what we see is that the largest number of deaths are occurring in the white population and in the male population, with females over 1,000 deaths annually, and in the black population down here, just under 1,000 deaths annually. So large numbers of folks are passing away from opioids. One of the things that we initiated based on the science was something called the pharmacophore rule. And it was a rule that we put in place to try to help combat what we were seeing with all these synthetic forms of fentanyl. Fentanyls that are produced in clandestine laboratories without the good laboratory practices. And what this rule really is about is looking at the chemical structure of a molecule. And a pharmacophore, it's a fancy word for the core portion of a molecule required for activity. So if we look at heroin, so heroin is an opioid. The red portion here is the pharmacophore, the core that's needed for activity. Many times I'll describe it as almost putting a mask on a person. Sometimes I would use the analogy of Christian Bale putting on a Batman costume. Underneath the costume is still Christian Bale, and the rest of this would be part of the costume. So this is heroin. Well, if we look at other opioids, we see here's morphine. Morphine, if you look at it, you can see where that red structure would have been. The core structure that's needed for activity is right here. Same thing with heroin, as we showed before. Same thing with oxycodone. Same thing with hydrocodone. Why am I pointing this out? All these molecules have the exact same core structure. What's changed are the costume that goes around that core structure. The name changes as a result of it. That's why we call it morphine or heroin or oxycodone or hydrocodone. Each of those chemical changes that are made changes something about the drug's mechanism of action and the way the body may actually be eliminated from the body. And so with morphine, heroin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, we know what some of those differences may be because they've been studied in clinical trials. But if we look at fentanyl, and this is the point I was wanting to make, this is fentanyl. The red here is that core structure, that pharmacophore, the key needed for activity. So the issue we have is that on the street, we don't see just fentanyl. We see other forms of fentanyl, like cyclopropylfentanyl. See this triangle group here? That's the cyclopropylfentanyl. It makes it just a little bit different chemically than fentanyl. Whereas parafluorofentanyl, another one, it has an extra carbon and a fluoral group up here. Again, the chemistry has been changed. What makes this so dangerous is that by making these chemical modifications, you've made new compounds that have not been tested in clinical trials. So we don't know their overall potency. We do not know if they respond well to naloxone. And so these compounds can be very dangerous as a result of not having all that information on those molecules. So if we look here in the state of Ohio, we've seen over 20 different forms of fentanyl. Some of them are fentanyl, clandestinely produced fentanyl. This is not the fentanyl that you may have heard of folks using to treat pain and cancer, or it's used in surgery. This is fentanyl that's been produced in those labs that I was showing you pictures of a few minutes ago. The other thing was, as I started this talk off with, was the picture of the rainbow fentanyl. We're seeing a lot of counterfeit prescription tablets being made. Now, these are counterfeit tablets that aren't dispensed by a pharmacist by a prescription. They are counterfeit tablets made to look like a prescription tablet. And so when we look at these pictures here, this is a picture of M30 tablets. They're OxyContin tablets. This is the authentic brand that is dispensed by a pharmacy to treat pain, whereas the bottom picture is a counterfeit tablet of M30 tablets, and that's what they're called on the street, or M30 tablets. This tablet here contained both oxycodone and fentanyl. The picture in the middle is a picture of Adderall. Adderall is a stimulant. Many times you'll hear of students using them, especially college students using them, trying to stay awake during final exam week. The top picture is a prescription, the prescription form of Adderall. The bottom is the counterfeit form. I bring this one up because in the state of Ohio, just in the last year, in the spring at Ohio State, 3 students actually overdosed on what they thought were Adderall tablets that they had purchased. Now, many of these tablets are sold online, and sometimes they're sold by dealers who will purchase them and then actually sell them on the street, or people will order them directly online. In this case, with the case that happened at Ohio State, the tablet didn't contain Adderall, it contained fentanyl. And then over here is a picture of what are known as totem poles on the street. They're authentic form of Xanax compared to a street form of Xanax. And in this case, the street form actually contained fentanyl. And if you combine fentanyl with the active ingredient of Xanax, which is alprazolam, you have 2 agents that can really work together to lead to respiratory depression. So there are counterfeit tablets that are out on the street that may be sold for one thing but may actually contain fentanyl. And many times folks do not even know they're being exposed to fentanyl when they purchase these counterfeit tablets. So with all that bad news, what are we doing to try to combat it? And so in the Attorney General's office, we formed the Scientific Committee on Opioid Prevention and Education, a group we call SCOPE. And this group is composed of scientists from all over the state of Ohio. And we started meeting in 2019, and we began to review the literature. And we looked at areas that may provide unique and innovative ways to target and combat the opioid epidemic and opioid overdose deaths. And through the review of the literature, we identified 4 target areas. And I'm not going to go through all 4 of these target areas tonight. I'll just briefly tell you what we identified from our review of the scientific literature. The first one, target area, was professional education. And what we did is we actually conducted a study where we actually surveyed all the healthcare programs in the state of Ohio. And we surveyed those programs to determine how students in medicine, pharmacy, nursing, physician assistant programs, dentistry programs, were actually being trained in the area of substance use disorder and opioid use disorder. And we had identified 6 areas where we could focus attention in the training of future healthcare professionals. Then we developed a course that was taken by all the healthcare programs in the state of Ohio in the spring, and we're now beginning to offer it throughout the year, where we target those 6 target areas, and then we developed an escape room model where healthcare students are put into teams based on discipline, so they're working in teams that consist of a pharmacist, a physician, a nurse, a PA, and a dentist, and they work through a case to get a dose of naloxone to save a patient. The second target area we identified was based on opioid storage and disposal. And what the data was showing is that if someone in your family receives a prescription for an opioid, that some family member within that family has a much higher likelihood of an overdose. And so proper storage of an opioid becomes important so that you keep it out of reach and out of common sight where someone could easily find it. We also partnered with the DEA to enhance the number of drug drop-off days so that the drugs could be incinerated when prescriptions were done being used. And these are the counties we've targeted to date. That's why we use this death rate data to target these counties. So the 7 counties hit, circled in red. We hit the top 3 initially, with it being Scioto, Fayette, and Franklin counties. And then we hit Clark and Montgomery counties and Trumbull and Mahoning counties to date. So we offer drug drop-off days in conjunction with the DEAs. We've collected over 1,500 pounds of drugs just through our drug drop-off days that are completed with the DEA. The third target area we hit was using a behavioral economic approach, and we're working with behavioral economists at the University of Cincinnati to actually look at how students in the grade schools and middle schools are taught to make decisions and use a decision-making process. Behavioral economics is not a new concept. Behavioral economics actually looks at how people make the decision to do something or not do something. And this has actually been studied in the United Kingdom with some success with high schoolers. And so we're developing that model right now to develop a model for that in the grade schools. But where I really want to focus my attention is the last area, target area 4, and that's the pharmacogenetic risk assessment study. So what is pharmacogenetics? And so PGX is what we abbreviate that. Many times I think what people think is this cartoon shows that, hey, here's my DNA sequence, handing their sequence to the pharmacist, who's then going to use that to hand the bottle to them for a specific drug. That is not what pharmacogenetics is. Pharmacogenetics looks at a specific change within a gene that's associated with how a drug produces its response. And so what we wanted to do is look at risk factors for developing opioid use disorder. So if we, as a general review, if we look at the structure of DNA, it's made up of bases, these adenine and thymine, guanines, and cytosines. And they always lined up in a certain ways, A's to T's and G's to C's. That's what this picture is showing. There's an A to a T, so adenine to thymine, a G to a C. And that's what allows the DNA to have that helix shape. Many times you'll see it described almost like a slinky shape, but it's because of the way those bases are lining up. When we look at a gene is a portion of just a DNA that encodes for a protein. Proteins are where drugs work. Drugs may bind to a receptor made up of, which is a protein. It's a change within the DNA for that protein that actually we are looking for to see if a drug is going to respond in a specific way. So when we are looking at the pharmacogenetics, we're looking for what's called a single nucleotide polymorphism. We actually call it a SNP. So SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms. When we look at DNA copies here, this TTAGCA, that's representing those bases. In this model here that I'm showing here, this is showing that the copy was good. This copy is exactly the same as the one before it. This one's a copy is exactly the one before it. But notice this one, TTATCA. That one letter change, that one base change can actually lead to a change in that protein. This one change could be the reason somebody may have black hair or blonde hair or red hair, blue eyes versus green eyes. One change in that code, that SNP, can contribute to those changes. That's what we wanted to look at in our study. And so what we did is we wanted to determine which genes were associated with the development of opioid use disorder. And in doing so, what we were hoping to do is develop a genomic opioid addiction risk score. What does that mean? That means that if you say you had to have knee replacement surgery and you go into have knee replacement surgery beforehand, you want to know how are we going to manage the pain afterwards. Potentially we could actually screen for 1 or 2 specific genes and then risk stratify patients into high, medium, low risk so that we can best manage their pain and try to avoid the development of opioid use disorder. That was the goal of our study. So what we did, we collaborated with the emergency departments at the University of Cincinnati and Ohio State University, and we recruited 1,301 patients in the study, and we screened 180 genes that were associated with either opioid metabolism or opioid function, meaning pharmacodynamics is what the drug does to the body and how it may interact with the reward pathways in the brain, those areas of the brain that are associated with euphoria in the brain. So when we did this was a cross-sectional genomics association study within these 3 large emergency departments in Ohio. But before the patients were enrolled into the study, they were screened for opioid use disorder using what's known as the DSM-5 criteria, where we trained our staff, our staff was trained by psychologists to screen for opioid use disorder. Then we obtained cheek and blood samples so that we could do the DNA analysis. And then we even went further and actually had the patients complete an extensive behavioral survey questionnaire so that we could learn more about the patient's decision-making, behavioral economic type questions that we asked the patient. But at this point, we've gotten through the DNA analysis. COVID-19 actually slowed us down in implementing all 4 of our target areas, but we've made progress in each one of these. So to date, we've been able to identify 4 specific genes related to OUD. 2 were shown at increased risk. 1, the CYP3A4 as we call it, is associated with how drugs are metabolized. This DRD3 is the dopamine D3 receptor, is associated with the reward pathway. And then notice we found 2 of these SNPs that were associated with a decreased risk. So we're still in the process of developing that GORE score, that risk association score, with this information, and also still analyzing the survey data. So the bottom line is that we wanted to be able to show you, here's what's happening in the state of Ohio. My team was looking at monitoring trends in opioid overdose deaths. We were looking at and monitoring new chemical molecules as they came out. But then we had 4 target areas that we developed research strategies and scientific methods to actually target: professional education, drug safety and disposal, that behavioral and economics piece, and what I just outlined with you, a brief section on the pharmacogenomics section. This is the scope team that I have the privilege of working with. If you notice there, we've got Beth is a nurse for us on our team. Caroline is our emergency room physician. Bill Miller is an epidemiologist. Tessa Miracle does a lot of epidemiology type research. Donnie Sullivan is a colleague of mine that does drug diversion research. Arthur Ye, who will be joining us here today. Dr. Ye is our data analytics person. He did all the stats for us. Renee Sarin is the behavioral economist on our team. Those that did the heavy lifting and did the data analysis and monitored the databases included Jamie and Chizen Lan, who's joining us, also a graduate student in computer science. Maggie McCorkle, Dave Kaiser is a colleague of mine and an expert in pharmacogenomics. And then Linda Deach is a colleague of mine within the Attorney General's office who helped in data curation for us also. And then as I finish up, before I take questions, I do want to make available, if anyone's looking for resources or know of anyone that might need help, there's a phone number you can call from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Beatthestigma.org is a useful website that's actually from the Ohio Opioid Education Alliance. And with that, Kevin, I'd open up to any questions that I may be able to answer.
Thank you, John. That was both very interesting and quite concerning. So next we'll have a question and answer and discussion session. If you would like to ask a question, please type your question in a private chat to me and I will ask your question for you. But first, John, can you introduce your panelists?
Sure. I'd like to introduce Dr. Arthur Ye. Dr. Ye is from the Business College here at BGSU. Specializes in statistics and data analysis. Dr. Ye really helped lead our team in the data analytics that we did. If Dr. Ye, if you could actually tell a little bit about your role on this project, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, John. So my name is Arthur Ye, and I work in the Department of Applied Statistics and Operations Research in the College of Business. My role in the committee, as well as in a number of works Jon and I worked on, is really on sort of the statistical analyses, modeling, trend analyses. I should add that I only contribute ideas in most cases where the person who actually does the heavy lifting is actually Chi-Sen. So I'm going to let Chi-Sen speak to his role in terms of doing all the ground lift, all the heavy lifting of statistical analysis.
Thank you, Chi-Sen. If you could tell us about your role.
So my role is I'm also from BGSU, and I'm one data science PhD student. So my role in this research is mainly doing the statistical analysis, the temperature analysis, and also the statistical modeling. So all those, also those graph plotting, those stuffs. So it's under the Dr. Ye's, supervised and advised. So I just do the coding work. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll start us off with my traditional first question. What got you interested in studying pharmacology and toxicology? And all the panelists can answer this, even though I know you're more focused on data analysis, like why get interested in this kind of data analysis? So you can start, Jon.
Yeah, so actually my PhD is in pharmacology and toxicology. I am a pharmacist by training. My PhD work was in the toxicology of the club drug ecstasy, and we looked at the neurotoxicity of ecstasy. And we've continued to work on those projects also in my laboratory. But it was really because of the studying that drug with an abuse potential that it rolled into this role looking at the opioids. And so it's just continued to expand as the opioid crisis has continued to grow. Of course, our interests begin to grow. Now Arthur and I were working with the SCOPE committee, and we identified those 4 target areas we were talking about, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were talking and wanting to know what is happening right now. How are things changing in that opioid world during the COVID-19 pandemic? And it grew into the data analysis that you saw today.
So I guess my interest in sort of opioid-related problems or research really came out of Jon's invitation back in 2019 when the Attorney General commissioned that SCOPE committee. Jon reached out to me asking whether I would be interested in serving at least as a sort of as a data guy in that committee, and I happily accepted it. And that's how I really got into opioid-related problems. Interesting enough, my role in SCOPE, I think, also helped in my role of working with Dr. Jin Lee from the College of Health and Human Services. I think in 2020, Dr. Lee and I actually were awarded by the state of Ohio for a major grant to study these problems. So I guess without Jon's invitation back in 2019 to get me involved, I think that would not have led me to getting rewarded for that. So I guess I have no one else to thank but Jon's. But again, I have worked as a statistician. I worked on a lot of applied problems, but mostly sort of more on the manufacturing side of it. And this is really the first time I worked on problems that are more human related, and I think probably has a bigger impact on the society as a whole than all the other problems I worked on, mostly on manufacturing processes. I don't know to what extent the manufacturing processes would actually help the society as a whole. I mean, they could, but I think this is sort it's just an eye opening for me, from from its decision to work on different types of problems in the past.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely feel that as well in my own research. Sometimes it's like I do some cool basic stuff that I really like, but those working on those applied problems can be really kind of fulfilling and you're really doing something important. Yeah, I agree. Chizen?
Right. So I'm just the same as Dr. Ye. So I have been work with the Dr. Lee from the Health and Human That department from the 2019. So before I start I'm on computer science dissertation early. So I work on that opioid related project. That can be called the star point. So later on, the Dr. Ye just asked me if there is another project if you want to involve, and it's quite related things. So I just joined this group and do my part work. And after reading those research and papers, so before that I didn't know I didn't even know what kind of drugs are opioids related. After that, I read a lot of the research and papers. I get more sense and sense this is important queries or problem in your eyes. So that's quite interesting to join this group. That's all.
Thank you, everyone. So let's dive into some of these questions in the chat. The first one is a question that I also had. So, you have that break in the trend lines, 2018, 2019 are lower. Why? Do you have any ideas why that might have occurred?
So the question is asking about, I'm gonna go back to this first slide, this break here. If you look at our data analysis, you see this break. Is this the question? I'm not sure I understood that question right there, Kevin. Is that what we're talking about? Yes?
Yeah, the dip in deaths in 2018, and then it goes back up a little in 2019, but it's still lower. Do we know why that was lower?
Yeah, that's been a really good question that I wished I had the answer to. In fact, when we were doing the data analysis, and even before we started our data analytics, when we were looking at the trend lines, we saw that there was this drop occurring in opioid overdose numbers between 2017 and 2018. And at the time, we were giving it credit to some of the efforts we were making at the state level to actually educate and inform the public. And then it kind of, you notice it flattened out really after that drop. It was kind of a flat trend here that occurred. And then COVID hit and we saw the spike up again. And so that's part of the reason that Arthur Chizen and I have suggested that maybe there is a potential fourth wave that's contributing to this, that with COVID-19 creating that perfect storm of social isolation, loss of jobs, those types of things that may have contributed. But
unfortunately, oh, go ahead.
I'd say I really don't know. I wish I had a good answer for why the downward trend in that one small period of time.
If I just add one point, I think, John, what you showed was the trend in the state of Ohio. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that sort of downward trend around 17, 18 period, that's also observed pretty much nationwide, if I remember that correct.
Yeah, these figures don't give us a good example, but you can kind of see it right here, Arthur. Yes, there is a downward trend there also. Same time frame. Not nearly to the magnitude that we saw, but it is there. Yep.
Yeah. Does that coincide with when they were starting to get a lot of publicity of some of these issues?
Yeah, it does actually, because once the fentanyl wave occurred, that wave 3 occurred, the public awareness, the public campaign took off, and I think that may have helped, but I don't have evidence to actually support that.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. Okay, so we've got another question in here. Are there any privacy concerns with identifying who might be prone to opioid use disorder? So I guess that's with the genetic techniques that you're trying to identify them.
Yeah, so when those studies are completed, they're actually, the patients are de-identified. We don't know who is who in contributing to that. And when you do those types of studies, if in the future, let's say that you're going to have that knee surgery, you're not getting somebody's full genome when you do that study. You're actually targeting specific genes, so you don't know everything about the person. So that's a really good question, because I think a lot of times if someone is having a genetic study done, they may think they're getting their whole genome and knowing everything about them. But for this type of study, it would be just specific, like in the end here, where we identified 4 or 5 genes, we only target those. So we only have just small pieces of information and not enough to actually identify anybody with it.
If I could just add, so what Jon and a couple other individuals on the scope committee looking at really from trying to identify genes that could differentiate between someone being more susceptible or less susceptible to becoming an opiate addict. What Dr. Chin-Ha Lee and I have been trying to do is actually looking at sort of more of an external factors, i.e., for instance, if you look at patients' characteristics such as gender, income, all sorts of factors, we will be able to come up with some sort of predictive model as to trying to predict the risk associated with that individual becoming an opiate addict. So that's what we've been looking at, sort of, it's from just very much the same purpose, but from a totally different viewpoint.
To play off of what Dr. Ye just said, is that with our study, with this behavioral survey portion, we obtained that exact same type of information, and we're using machine learning coupled with the genetic information to actually expand that out to, could you actually ask a series of 5 questions and maybe screen 2 genes and combine this information to actually have a better predictive score.
Very interesting. Okay, so I guess we'll go to the next question. I have some more things in my head, but I want to get to questions from the audience. So is there any data related to the use of naloxone as a means to prevent opioid death? Is it effective when fentanyl is involved at doses provided by free drug companies, free drug programs? Sorry.
Yeah, naloxone is an effective tool for reversing fentanyl overdoses. In fact, there's a big campaign by the Ohio Opioid Education Alliance in making naloxone available so as to help prevent overdoses. The thing we don't know with some of the synthetic forms or the chemical modifications is the half-life, meaning how long it stays in the body, how often do you have to redose, and is the dose effective against every single form of the opioid. We're also seeing other forms of synthetic opioids that are coming out that are novel, that we've not seen before, that we need to determine if naloxone will work for, but for fentanyl it will work.
Great, at least we have a tool. I think this is next question. It's a little long, but I think it's related to something I was thinking about as well. So have there been any studies performed around outpatient community pharmacists identifying high-risk individuals and positive outcomes of this identification? And I was sort of thinking that as a follow-up to what you were saying before, like if you're screening 5 questions and a couple of genes, would that help, identify who, is at risk and then reduce, prescriptions?
Yeah, so is a question, I guess, just for clarification, if I could, Kevin, is it about the genetic piece, or is it about just outpatient pharmacy?
Yeah, it's not about the genetic piece. That was my own sort of add-in.
Okay. Yeah, the outpatient pharmacy piece, I'm not familiar with a tool that's specific for that. I'm just not familiar with any that outpatient pharmacists are doing those types of things, but it doesn't mean it's not been done. I'm just not familiar with it.
Okay, yeah. I think I'll jump to one of my questions real quick that's related. Have there been any studies looking at if there are genes associated with the overdose specifically?
There have been studies that have looked at the genes that might be affiliated with the risk for overdose. So there's some work that's been done in that area, and there's been a handful of genes that have been identified there also.
Cool. Okay, so here's another one from the audience. What made Dr. Sprague focus more on fentanyl opposed to other drugs that were mentioned?
Yeah, actually, just by chance, I have the graph up in front of me that really drives that decision. It was just by chance. When you're looking at the overdose death numbers from opioids, you see right here that now the squares, the open squares, fentanyl is the primary driver of overdose deaths right now with fentanyl. That's what really caused us to focus on fentanyl, just because of the sheer number.
I'm just guessing here. Maybe they're thinking about other drugs also that aren't opioids, like why opioids, I guess.
Yeah, I think if you look at what we see a lot of in the crime lab here in Ohio is methamphetamine. We see a lot of methamphetamine. We don't see the same number of overdose deaths from methamphetamine that we see with opioids. Opioids lead to that respiratory depression that ultimately can lead to death. Whereas methamphetamine, yeah, your heart rate can go up, your blood pressure can go up, it can lead to heart conditions and/or strokes. But the death rate is so much higher with an opioid than you see with something like methamphetamine, or cocaine even, for that matter.
So those other ones have public health issues as well, but maybe not quite as severe in terms of deaths. Yeah.
Correct. I think, and that's, I mean, you look at 107,000 deaths in 2021, with the majority of those being from an opioid, and with the majority of those opioids being a fentanyl, you can see why we focused our attention on fentanyl.
Yeah. So this next question is actually following up on what is kind of what I was saying before is, so you've got this genetic research and maybe some other questions that could help inform, who might be most likely to become addicted. Can you discuss how that data and research will inform policy related to opioid addiction therapy, rehabilitation, and prevention? They mention effectiveness, time frame, or reform at different levels.
Yeah, I guess when you look at what our role is, what Arthur and I do and the Scope Committee does, is to use science to inform our colleagues that make policy. We don't make policy, but what we'd love to be able to see is to be able to help in a way that allows for policymakers and for the public in general to understand what they might be able to do to help reduce the risk. So if the genetic information can actually be made available that can determine or help reduce overall risk for developing opioid use disorder, that's our ultimate goal in general. It would be nice if in the future, before an opioid is prescribed, we could actually ask those questions and screen for those genes and have a feel for their susceptibility. That would be the ultimate goal. But we have to go through and validate this, work with clinicians to actually, show that this is having a major impact. But this is the first step to moving in that direction.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a question that's a little bit out of left field, but I think it's thought-provoking and interesting. So what if, you were to remove that gene during in vitro fertilization? If you found the gene and you could then remove it, would that be possible? And let's see, would that be available? So I'll let you think about that one.
Wow, that's a really good question. Is it possible? Potentially, right? Using different technology that we now have, could you do it? Wow. In theory, I think it could be done. I don't know how practical, how inexpensive it would be, and what would be the ramifications from doing so, meaning basically what's the risk to benefit profile from it. So that's a long ways off for us, but in theory it is something that could be done. That's a really good question. That's almost futuristic to the point that I don't know if I can answer that well.
Yeah, we had an interesting discussion in the biology department related to that recently. There's a lot of ethical considerations for sure.
Absolutely.
So here's this will be our second to last question, I think. So this is interesting. So thinking about COVID, right? And because COVID caused respiratory distress, could that be sort of interacting with overdose? Could it be COVID and opioids are causing sort of, more likely overdose?
That's a really good question. I don't know. The possibility is real, right? I mean, that combination could play a role for sure. I think that's one thing that we could actually look into the ODH database and see if we have a listing for COVID and opioids, and can we combine those two and just see if there was any potential for there being an association. But in theory, yeah, that makes sense.
So I do like to point out, though, I think that jump that you see in the graph, jump show, I think that occurred in second quarter of 2020. And if my recollection of what had happened, in the last couple years, I'm not sure in the early, so that second quarter of 2020 was probably still considered to be early stage of the epidemic. So I'm not sure as far as people getting infected in that early stage. I don't think the number is there yet. I mean, you probably see a way higher numbers of people getting infected toward maybe the end or the middle, the end of 2020. So the point though is that I'm not sure whether some of these steps have any sort of relationship with them being infected with COVID. I mean, that's my quick thought.
In fact, when you say that, Arthur, when we looked at that data in the Ohio Department database, the death certificate had to list opioid as the cause of death.
So I will end with a slightly lighter question. If you, there's quite a few students in the audience today, I think. If you could give one piece of advice to aspiring students, what would it be? And that'd be a question for all three of you.
Aspiring to be scientists?
Aspiring to be scientists or to go into this area of research.
Yeah, I say my advice would be never lose that excitement to learn. Always want to learn, ask questions, and then design studies to answer that question. If you have that, you can make it as a scientist. The big thing for all of us, all three of us here tonight, is that we want to use our science to actually help the public, and that's the whole goal here, is that use the data to have an impact.
So for me, I'm a statistician. So for me, what really excites me are just basic data, right? And then data come from different types of applications. So, I may be more interested in certain types of applications than other people, but to me, the bottom line is, if the problems actually interest me enough, and there are plenty of data for me to really, take deeper dive in it. And so those are the things that really keep me excited for all these years. I mean, this is my 29th year here with the university, and I tell students every time I get my hands on any type of data, I still feel like really excited, like a little kid. Like if I don't feel that excitement, that's probably time for me to retire. But I still do. I mean, that's what really drives me. I mean, it's the opportunity to get my, to take a deeper dive in any types of data, and hopefully would come up with solutions or insights that would help, maybe other scientists from different fields. That's really what excites me.
So I asked some students. So I guess is one good thing is like Dr. Ye said, you need to get the patient to really interested to those data, allow your analysis, and also one suggestion is don't afraid to try a new field. So there is something good, and you may want to involved and to get interest, and that will be happiness to you to know as much as you can about the cross fields scientists and project or research, that could be, I mean, a good thing to you. Right.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for a great discussion, a great event. We also have a great lineup of speakers coming up. Next month, we have Wendy Manning from the Department of Sociology. And then later on, we're going to have Amanda Cook from the Department of Economics and Julia Halo from the Department of Biology. So thank you all for coming tonight, and keep a lookout for some emails about those events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.